2, 1.
2, 1.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joseph Castellano. I'll be speaking to you today about phenotypes and vigilance modeling as it pertains to neurotherapy and a little bit about medication selection. I am a LPCC here in the state of Colorado. I have a master's degree in somatic psychotherapy. I'm also a QEEG technologist and board certified neurotherapist and mentor of this work. I'm the founder of Alpine Neurotherapy, a small clinic here in Boulder, Colorado, that does a variety of things, including various kinds of neurofeedback, direct and alternating current, random noise, pulse EMF, and biofeedback, including heart rate variability, skin conductance, skin temperature, etc. Before I walk you through this, I'd like to invite you to just take a look at the image on the right, and just sit with it for a second and consider waves riding on waves. And we will come back to this at the end. So, the first part of this was originally intended for a cohort of psychiatrists who were doing a 2-year continuing education program around ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So the first piece of this is, really a journey back to basics for those of us in the ISNR community. And I encourage you and invite you, please stay with me here. I promise we'll get where we're going. So without further ado, let's begin. For disclosures, I have a relationship with iMediSync, or the iSync Brain Corporation. I've partnered with them for about a year now. They've been graciously letting me use their software, and I've been providing feedback about how to streamline that. Going forward, I will be doing mentoring for them and a host of other things in collaboration. I have a partnership with the Mind Alive Corporation and Dave Seaver that offers AVE and CES entrainment devices. Biomedical Corporation, which is a distributor of hardware, software, and gels and pastes. Long-time relationship with them, and as well with Live Complexity Training and Douglas Daly, really one of the most forward-looking pieces of neurofeedback that I've seen in a very long time. I'm very encouraged about where this work is going. So what we'll be covering today, we're going to define basic terms of EEG and QEEG, describe various brainwaves and their functions, simply conceptualize the phenotype and vigilance modeling as it pertains to EEG and QEEG, and describe how phenotype and vigilance modeling can be useful to guide medication selection and neurotherapy. We'll touch a little bit on both of those. So, to begin, electroencephalography is a field that focuses on the study of brain waves. This is used in sleep studies and has been for a very long time. It's used in neurology and epileptology. It's pretty foundational in the world of neurofeedback and neurotherapy. And you can see here that there is a map of the head with CZ as the vertex or the crown of the head. Nose is in the front, left ear, right ear. This is the 10-20 system where we have T3, T4, T5, T6. This is the 10-20 nomenclature. If you look over here in this left column, this is in fact the 10-10 nomenclature, which is more commonly used in the world of neuroscience. Neither is right or wrong per se. And in both of them, we have the frontal sites here, the frontal lobe, the temporal area. There is no central lobe, but this is still what we call it, C3, CZ, C4, the crown of the head. This is the sensory motor cortex. From P7 over to P8 or T5 over to T6. We are looking at the temporal parietal junctions here in the lateral portion of the head, and in fact, the parietal lobe here in the middle. Odd numbers are on the left, even numbers are on the right. Anything with a Z goes down the middle. And lastly, we have the occipital lobe here in the back of the head. Now, if you look here in this sample of EEG that I've picked, you can see that the EEG on the left and the EEG on the right look dramatically differently. Hopefully you can see that. And this big rhythm back here, this is an alpha rhythm. Not so much seen here except for this one electrode. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. but there is some frontal alpha. You know, just something to consider as we get going. So quantitative EEG is the outcome of a computerized process that transforms the brainwaves into their digital outputs. And what you can see here is 3D Z-scores, complements of the iSync Brain Corporation. We have a topograph that has a feature of the EEG, the spectral display, the topomap of where the dipoles or positive and negative aspects of the neuronal bundles, its location, and in fact, where the software calculates this is coming from. In this case, it's the anterior cingulate. Very common in all kinds of functions, especially mental health. This comes up quite a bit. Here we're looking at connectivity, what parts of the brain are tied into this feature of the anterior cingulate. And this is a somewhat old school Loretta image that we still use quite regularly. Brainwaves. I'm not going to read all of the details of this, but the slowest waves we'll be talking about today are delta waves at 1 to 4 cycles a second. Very involved in sleep, also involved in complex problem solving and laying down myelinated nerve traffic. So when we talk about myelinated nerves, or essentially high-speed fiber in the brain, delta waves are crucial in laying those down. And that is generated in the cortex or thalamocortically. Theta is limbic. It's the next fastest and very involved in creativity, deep states of consciousness, very common in meditative states, and very common feature with anxiety, depression. Generally what we see here when we see a lot of ADHD is a limbic projection into the cortex. And again, we'll come back to that in just a second. Alpha is thalamocortical. It's very involved in alert and readiness states. Generally, when we talk about flow states, that involves a lot of alpha. Sensory motor rhythm from 12 to 15 hertz. This is in the lower beta band or low beta, but it is in fact generated from the thalamus. Barry Sturman will back me up on that one, I believe. Very involved in mental alertness, physical relaxation, and commonly used in neurotherapy for sleep stabilization. Beta and high beta, these are cortical, very involved in organizing rhythms, doing things, paying attention, salience networks. And high beta is more of a fight or flight response, intense hypersensitivity to things. If you were a bodyguard, a security guard, a trader, it would serve you well to have a bit of this, but when it gets rogue, it can really disrupt your sleep and cause a lot of anxiety. Gamma, and this will really be the honorable mention of gamma in the course of this talk, but gamma is the emergent property of a bound network. Unlike the other waves we've discussed, it doesn't have a specific generator per se. When a network lights up or binds, one of the things that happens is a resonance, and this resonance gives rise to gamma. Gamma is involved in higher states of thinking, complex problem solving, realization. Sort of these aha moments that people experience are generally related to functions of gamma. So moving on. So now we are looking at a normative brain versus a quote unquote neurotypical ADHD brain. And in an eyes open condition in the theta frequencies, you can see that there is, 2 standard deviations, excess theta and the frontocentral midline. Another term for this is frontal lobe hypoperfusion. And, it's one of, the more common presentations that we see with ADHD. And this is what this looks like with the flat maps. And here you're looking at a quote unquote normative brain. And here we're looking at a fairly neurotypical ADHD brain in an eyes open condition. One of the guides for the medical community that I hope they take away from is a bit of an orientation of how to make sense of these flat maps and reports as they come across their desks. And for those of you who haven't seen these before, it's likely that you will. In the world of neurotherapy, these are very, very common. I mean, this is from the iSync Corporation database. I really liked that they're putting this into 8 buckets. I mean, typically it's often been done in 5, but the extra granularity can be really helpful in interpreting the EEG in this way. And here, you can see if we're looking at these Z-scores of, 1 and 2 and often 3. Here we're looking at up to 2 or 196. This is a lot of green. This person is very normative, and it's really important to take a moment and clarify what we mean by this, because I have no authority to tell you what normal is. But when a group of people get together and create a database, they have inclusion, exclusion criteria, and based on that, they create a database. And when we are often conducting a QEEG process, we are comparing a given client's brain to this normative sample, not to be confused with normal. Because, I mean, this person, while very, very normative, is a very exceptionally bright human. And you can see here that there's like little bits of, in the 1.5-ish range on this. Over here with the ADHD brain, you can see that we're in the, 1.96 standard deviations above the norm. And, per Yuri Kropotov, we're really looking at about 7-to-1 ratio to use this diagnostically for ADHD, which is quite extreme if you consider that 2 standard deviations would still put this person in the 95th percentile. And generally in the world of QEEG, we are not using this diagnostically, more prognostically. We don't go in looking for a diagnosis. We go in looking for a exploration of to what extent is this brain healthy in its ability to regulate itself or not, and what can we do to move the brain towards a greater state of function and wellness. So now we are looking at a normative brain versus a low voltage fast. This is actually a typo because this is an eyes closed condition. My apologies. And here in the alpha 1 frequencies, you can see that, the brain is in fact a full 2 standard deviations below the norm. And, that speaks to the degree to which this brain is not able to produce an adequate amount of alpha, which is an idling rhythm. So the brain is kind of stuck in an on mode in a state of over-arousal. This is what this looks like in the flat maps. And you can see here 2 standard deviations. And if we widen this band up, you would see that it went even deeper. But for the sake of comparing apples and apples throughout the slide and the presentation, I kept it this way. Again, this is that normative brain in an eyes closed condition. And here we are looking at 2 standard deviations below the norm in both absolute and relative power. Now, with absolute power, we are comparing each of these bins to this normative sample. With relative power, we are just comparing the amount of alpha 1 relative to delta, theta, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, and gamma. It's just this one extra step. Often people find this a bit confusing, but it's really no more complex than that. Now, moving on to depressive brains, and often, and I've seen quite a bit of literature implying that there's this, really reliable feature of depressive alpha asymmetries versus depressive beta spindling. And here you can see that there is, in fact, if I give this another lap, let it come around, let it come around. You can see here on the beta, I mean, this is pretty excessive. And this alpha asymmetry, I mean, it's there, but it's not super profound. And something to consider is that when this has really had its feet held to the fire in the research, the alpha asymmetry doesn't generally hold up as the beta, not in the same way. So here we are looking at this, in absolute power, and you can see there's a bit more going on over here on the right side than there is on the left. And, in relative power, it gets a little bit more easy to see, but not so much. And again, when this has been held to task in the research, it really doesn't generally hold up. As far as the beta spindling goes, I mean, this in absolute power, you can see that we're here in this, 85th-ish percentile for beta spindling. And you can see that it is both frontally and centrally And when we look at it in relative power, it's quite excessive. And as far as clinical presentations, these people actually seem reasonably similar in terms of shutting down. Generally, people who have the alpha asymmetry, more left over right, are more socially withdrawn. Those right over left, they say, tend to be more of an anxious presentation. With the beta spindling folks, it's really more a case that their brain is so over aroused that it's shutting down. They're just shutting down their social context and interaction because it's just overwhelming. So as we look to explore and clarify this line in the sand between what is EEG and what is QEEG, it's a bit murky at times from my perspective. And, you know, something Jay Gunkelman has taught me many times through the years is that, you know, everything that happens from when we examine the EEG in a linear algebra signal processing piece of software like WinEEG, up until we produce the spectra. I mean, this is the world of EEG. And once we run it through the fast Fourier transform and we produce a spectra, and this is a spectra, to visualize frequency, power, and coherence. And again, consistent with what I said at the beginning, FP1, FP2, this is the forehead, left and right. Anything with a Z is down the middle. Here we're looking at the left temple. Here we're looking at the right temple. And you can see that there's some slow activity in the brown, a little bit of alpha in the yellow. And this here on the motor strip is called mu. We'll come back to that a little bit in a second. So as we start to transition out of the basics into where we're going in phenotypes and vigilance modeling, here we are looking at a brain. This is the brain of one of the people who's come into my clinic for a very long time. I've done quite a bit of work with this person. And you know, here their eyes open alpha peak frequency is at about 9.5 hertz, which is well within a normative range. You know, maybe a touch slower than, but not really. I mean, this is still within one standard deviation. And their coherence also maps out and peaks out at this 9.5 hertz. We see this frontally, it projects like from a bit right towards left. So we might see some effect on an idling around executive functioning or working memory, but it's also recruiting some of this right portion, and the coherence value of 0.6. It could be expressed as a percentage, the percentage to which these waves are similar or not, but that's not the language and how it's used. So we would say a coherence value of 0.6. And this would be just inside the clinically relevant range. Now, curious fact about this individual, in the eyes closed condition, their alpha peak frequency accelerates to 10.5 hertz. So it's about a 12% jump. Now, for most people, closing their eyes is a relaxing process. For this individual, maybe not so much. And how do we make sense of this? I mean, one way would be that the frame rate of the brain speeds up by 12%, and I have witnessed this person on numerous times closing their eyes when deep in thought about something. So, I mean, they've in some ways learned or adapted to make use of this attribute in which their brain functions. But also kind of interesting that, like, what does this say about their vigilance? That when they close their eyes, their brain speeds up. Also curious with this individual that their coherence value maxes out also at about this 0.6 coherence value, but at 12.5 cycles a second. So this demonstrates that at 12.5 cycles per second, their brain has the maximum recruitment of the frontal lobe, really affecting the entire frontal lobe for our purposes. But it shows a real tendency to speed up in an eyes closed condition. And what does this tell us about the manner in which the way this person perceives and interacts with their world? So, you know, other steps on our way to where we're going, something to consider. Loretta is a source localization tool and used very commonly in the world of neurotherapy to identify the generators. And we often use independent component analysis. I mean, one, to clean the EEG files as we prepare QEEG analyses. but also to identify the generators. So here we can look at this snip of EEG. Hopefully you can see these waves are very, very similar in nature. Here's an image of Loretta and the plugin that I use often in Winning EEG. And here is an independent component as seen in the iSync database. And you can see here in the EEG, this is not a single electrode, but it's the summation of activity, a specific feature in the EEG. And here, when we look at the power spectra, you can see here that there's a peak at around 5 hertz, another peak at 10, another peak at 15. When we look at the topo map, you can see here that there is, in fact, excess theta at this frontal midline. This gives us the source localization, and the MNI information helps us locate this Brodmann area 24 and the anterior cingulate. Just for further clarification, these independent components are maximally spatially and temporally independent features in the EEG. iSync is using the adaptive mixture ICA, which is really the leading edge technology currently for doing this work. Once you have this, there's a free resource. Many in the neurotherapy community are aware of this. For those of you who aren't, it's really a great resource. You can go to fmriconsulting.com, and there's a really great free resource, and you can identify Brodmann area 24, the anterior cingulate, move right along. And if you go down and you say, look, I'm working with this client and they're struggling with issues of working memory, neuroimaging studies on working memory, meta-analysis by Torwager and Edward Smith. There's another paper. And this is a really useful free resource if you're trying to understand whether it's fMRI or SPECT scans or whatever is available. But there's really a huge resource available for free. Generally not as much on the EEG side of things, but it's always great to do a little bit of extra digging to really understand different perspectives of what's happening with your clients' brains.